Hello friends, and welcome to my 2020 Halloween video. And as is tradition, it is time for Bela to come out of his coffin. And if this is your first time, Bela is my black shrouded special Halloween pipe. This pipe is made by Jesse Jones, special for Halloween. You can see the skull embellishments there on the band. It's a nice, what I guess you'd call a stacked billiard. Maybe a poker, I don't know. And Bela only comes out once a year, the week before Halloween. Goes back to sleep the day after Halloween. And is always filled with Haunted Bookshop. Let's go ahead and get that packed and lit as I begin to tell you a bit about this year's film. So this year's video. Film, rather pretentious of me. So each year for the past 3 years, hard to believe this is the 4th year I'm doing this, I've been doing a sort of video about each of the actors that made up the great Universal classic monsters. So I did a Boris Karloff, a Bela Lugosi, and most recently a Lon Chaney Jr. video. And that was my goal when I set out. I thought, I wanted to do something about Karloff. And then I thought, well, I've done that. I might as well do all 3. And then I did that, and now I had to figure out what I'm going to do next. So what I decided to do is a little bit different this year. I'm not focusing on one actor. I'm actually focusing on one character, which is Frankenstein. And I'm focusing specifically on Hammer Studios' interpretation of Frankenstein, because we've talked enough about the Universal interpretation. So this was a lot of fun, a lot of Hammer films on Frankenstein, and I'm going to talk about all of them in this video. And of course we're going to get plenty of Peter Cushing talk, but not talk specifically about the actor and his life, but his portrayal of the Baron Frankenstein. Got the special Halloween tamper that sleeps with Bela. This was made and given to me by my dear friend Danny Shore, and I cherish this in Danny's memory, but also know that Danny would be quite pleased to know that his tamper has become a special part of the Halloween season. I'll place that back into the coffin. So I asked you to choose the best pipe for your Halloween. Fill it with some tobacco that you'll enjoy. Have a beverage of choice, and join me as we explore the Hammer Frankenstein films. Enjoy, my friends. The name Hammer is synonymous with Gothic horror, and has given us stars the likes of Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, and Oliver Reed. Hammer is best known for its prolific output of horror films beginning around 1955. However, the studio has a much longer history, being founded in 1934 by William Hines, better known by his stage name Will Hammer. Hammer Studios has continued producing films into the 2000s, representing an over 70-year history. But it is that classic horror period from 1955 through the 1970s for which Hammer is best known. The impact of Hammer horror must be understood in terms of the time in which the studio began producing horror films. The reign of Universal Studios horror, which began in the 1920s with Carl Laemmle's Phantom of the Opera, and gave us the great quartet of Universal classic monsters, Dracula, the Frankenstein monster, the Wolfman, and the Mummy, had come to a sad end in the late 1940s and early 1950s, with Abbott and Costello upstaging these horror icons. In short, horror was dead. This was the backdrop through which Hammer Studios burst onto the horror stage, beginning in 1955 with Hammer's production of the sci-fi horror film The Quatermass Experiment, a screen adaptation of a British TV serial that showed the guts and gore side of horror in a way that no one had seen before.
What do you think you're doing? Are you in pain? Is it something to do with your arm? Look, I'll just take a look. I won't hurt it, I promise.
Tame by today's standards, the film was groundbreaking in its time. It was not at all well received by the critics. As one wrote, "The TV pseudoscience shocker The Quatermass Experiment has been filmed, and quite a mess they've made of it too." He then went on to call the film, and I quote, 82 minutes of sick-making twaddle. Despite the poor critical response, the film was a major success, becoming the most successful film released in the UK that year. Quatermass spawned several sequels and really deserves a video of its own in the Hammer series, perhaps the basis of a future Halloween video. What matters for us was that Hammer was financially solvent and soon turned its attention to the world's best-known mad scientist. In 1957, Hammer released The Curse of Frankenstein. Their original hope was to produce a film with a fair number of similarities to the 1931 Universal Frankenstein, and it even contacted Boris Karloff to play the Baron. However, Universal threatened a lawsuit if the film in any way resembled their original production, so Hammer had to reinvent the story as well as the look of the film. The movie begins with the Baron, portrayed by the great Peter Cushing, in prison. He requests a priest for confession and tells his story in the hopes that someone will believe him and rescue him from his execution, which is scheduled to occur in just 1 hour. The priest reluctantly agrees, and the remainder of the film is presented in flashback. The young Baron, played by Melvin Hayes, is orphaned when his mother dies, and he obtains his own tutor, one Paul Krempe, played by Robert Urquhart. We see Paul Krempe and the Baron working together as the Baron learns and grows, and ultimately Paul Krempe becomes the Baron's lab assistant. Together they manage to restore life to a dead dog, and from this point on we see a Baron Frankenstein as a character very different from the Universal Pictures Baron.
Paul, it's alive. Paul, we've done it. Paul, we've done it.
While the Universal Frankenstein was driven by his desire for forbidden knowledge, he never lost his humanity. This new Frankenstein is ruthless in his pursuit of knowledge, caring nothing for those around him, including his fiancée Elizabeth. So ruthless that he's willing to commit murder to obtain a brain for his creature, and later uses the monster to murder in order to cover up the inconvenient pregnancy of Justine, one of his maids with whom he was having an affair. And this brings us to the monster. The first Hammer monster is quite different from the creature brought to life by Boris Karloff in the Universal Classic. This monster is played by a relatively unknown Christopher Lee. It is grotesque in a way that only Hammer could have brought to the screen. He is an animated corpse, half dead, half alive, and bearing the scars of his creation. Karloff played the creature like an overgrown child. We have compassion for the poor thing as he clumsily shares a tender moment or two, only killing when provoked or confused. There are no tender moments with the Hammer monster. He kills or tries to kill everyone he meets. He is a twisted and violent creation that is driven to murder. One obvious development that Hammer pioneered in this production that cannot be overstated is the use of color. The Curse of Frankenstein was filmed in Technicolor and was the first color horror film. Hammer used a muted pastel background that is almost a signature of Hammer horror of this period. The colors create a pleasant depth to the scenery, with one unique effect. Red, the color of blood, leaps out of the screen with a shocking vibrance. Note how your eyes are drawn to the flower on Elizabeth's dress in this scene. This is in sharp contrast with the former use of blood in black and white films, where much was left to the viewer's imagination, and with a chilling effect. I personally find the use of Technicolor blood in modern horror to be so overdone as to border on comical. But Hammer found a balance, and they used it to horrifying effect.
What are you going to do?
Take the head off. It's no use to me anyway.
The Curse of Frankenstein was made for $270,000 and it grossed over $8 million at the box office. Hammer had struck gold in the Baron and his creature. Capitalizing on their success, Hammer released The Revenge of Frankenstein in 1958. This film begins essentially where the first film ended. The Baron, again played by Peter Cushing, has escaped the guillotine and has set up shop in the town of Karlsbruck under the alias Victor Stein. He is joined by a young Dr. Hans Kleve, played by Francis Matthews, who has guessed his true identity and wishes to study under the Baron Frankenstein to learn what they will not teach in the universities. Taking advantage of the easy access to body parts provided by his work at the poor hospital, Frankenstein has built a near-perfect body and plans to transplant a live brain into it. The brain is to be provided by Karl, the hunchback, played by Oscar Kwiatek. Karl saved the Baron from the guillotine in return for his promise of a new body. The Baron in this film is as driven as ever to complete his experiments. However, he appears a bit less ruthless than the previous Hammer incarnation. Yes, he takes advantage of his underprivileged patients by gathering parts for his creature, but he does not stoop to murder. And by the end of this film, we feel a bit of compassion for him. Likewise, the creature, played by Michael Gwynn, is not the bloodthirsty murderer of the first film, and his handsome normal appearance is in stark contrast to Christopher Lee's corpse-like depiction. However, this does not last, as the creature's brain is damaged in a fight, leading him to revert to the crippled form of Karl, and to not only murder, but in a twist that only Hammer could have given us, the creature turns to cannibalism. This film ends with a surprising twist that leaves us with the Baron and Hans relocated to London, and with Frankenstein receiving patients as Dr. Frank. 6 years later, Hammer released The Evil of Frankenstein. Peter Cushing again returns as the Baron Frankenstein, and the film opens with him working in a remote woodland shack, assisted by Hans, played by Shander Ellis. The location is not disclosed, however it appears they are back in Switzerland. A local priest discovers that they are once again in the body-snatching game, and they must take flight. They travel to Frankenstein's hometown of Karlstadt, which he has apparently been banished from. Their goal in returning is to sell his belongings for the money they will need to continue their research. Along the way, the Baron tells the story of why he had to flee Karlstadt, which is portrayed in flashback. It is unfortunate, at least in my opinion, that this is one of the first of the films to break continuity in a complete way with the previous film. As one critic put it, any pretext of connection to the Revenge of Frankenstein is dispensed with in a brazen display of contempt for continuity. A flashback creates a prior history that is wholly unrelated to the last script and is instead plundered from Universal's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman.
Get away from him! We've heard what you've been up to, Baron. You're under arrest.
And indeed it was. Instead of the fully formed man of Michael Gwynn's portrayal, this film's creature, played by New Zealand wrestler Ernie Kiwi Kingston, is closer to the Jack Pierce creation from the original Universal films. Sadly, it looks like someone left Karloff's creature out in the rain. It is notable that many similarities to the Universal film appear in this one. The use of lightning, the raising of a lightning rod through the castle roof, electrodes on the monster. This is because Hammer had signed a deal with Universal to distribute the film, which freed them up from copyright infringement, which Universal had threatened on the earlier films. Cushing's Baron is once again driven to complete his experiments at all cost. However, any ruthless nature is dwarfed by the appearance of the morally challenged Zoltan, played by Peter Woodthorpe. Zoltan is a hypnotist that the Baron enlists to activate the creature's brain, and Zoltan then capitalizes on his control over the creature to blackmail Frankenstein, steal from the church, and murder folks for relatively minor insults. 3 years later, Hammer released Frankenstein Created Woman. The film opens with the guillotine execution of the father of a young boy named Hans. Hammer had paid good money for that prop guillotine, and boy did they use it. We later learned that Hans is an assistant to one Dr. Hertz, played by Thorley Walters, who assists the Baron Frankenstein. Peter Cushing returns as the Baron, and he is no longer stitching body parts together. Instead, he now plans to capture the soul of someone at the moment of death and place it in a different body. Much of this film's plot revolves around a love affair between Hans and the local tavern owner's daughter, Christina Kleva. Christina, played by Playboy playmate Susan Dennisberg, is scarred and her body is twisted, which leads to her being teased by some of the local young miscreants. In an overly complex plot, the young roustabouts wind up murdering Christina's father and framing Hans for the murder. Hans goes to the guillotine, Christina kills herself by leaping into the river, and the Baron captures Hans' soul, rebuilds Christina's body, and places Hans' soul therein.
Keep still.
It's all right, my dear, it's all right.
There, Doctor. Your handiwork. You can be proud of it.
My handiwork, but your brain.
So the creature is actually played by Miss August 1966 and is quite stunning. The new Christina/Hans winds up going on a murderous rampage, killing the guys responsible for the death of her father and himself. While there's really not much to comment on here, there is one surprising plot point in that the Baron requires Dr. Hertz to perform the surgeries under his direction because he has burned his hands beyond repair. This may be an attempt to recall the fiery end of the last film. However, that is the lone point of continuity, and it really seems to be thrown in as an afterthought. If you are thinking that Frankenstein Created Woman represents the franchise going off the rails, I assure you that is not the case. It is in 1969's Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, where I believe the folks at Hammer just ran out of steam. The movie is once again a beautifully filmed Gothic piece, but Peter Cushing's Baron is the only thing that remotely links this film to the others. There's no creature per se, and the Baron is portrayed not so much as a driven genius willing to rob a few graves to test his theory. No, here Frankenstein is more likened to a serial killer, a murderous villain, and a rapist, with a creepy lair and a scary mask. plot is rather thin. Frankenstein was collaborating with Dr. Brandt, played by George Pravada, and Brandt had promised to share the secret of freezing brains before he was driven mad by his work. Frankenstein plans to steal him away from the asylum, repair his brain, and then apparently to calmly resume their collaboration. Brandt has a heart attack during his abduction, so Frankenstein decides to transplant Brandt's brain into another body, one unwillingly supplied by Professor Richter, played by Freddie Jones. The procedure is a success, but the Brandt-Richter creature, if it can be considered to be a creature, is not so willing to cooperate. As is often the case in Frankenstein films, all ends in flames. A year later, Hammer released a film that represents the low point in the Hammer Frankenstein cycle, The Horror of Frankenstein. In this 1970 film, Ralph Bates plays the role of the Baron Frankenstein in what is essentially a retelling of the first film, The Curse of Frankenstein. While there are some notable similarities, the film is far from a remake and feels almost like a spoof. Within the first 10 minutes of the film, young Victor convinces his geometry teacher that the teacher is having a heart attack in order to avoid a punishment, seduces a schoolmate by convincing her that they are involved in necessary research in anatomy, commits fratricide, goes off to the University of Vienna where he impregnates the dean's daughter, and suggests that he performs an abortion when the dean discovers his daughter's condition.
Pregnant, sir. My daughter is pregnant.
Congratulations.
Congratulations? Is that all you can find to say?
At the moment, sir.
What I would like to know is what do you intend to do about it?
I do have all my medical degrees. Couldn't I give her a quick operation?
Really, the only notable thing about The Horror of Frankenstein is the portrayal of the creature by 6'6" actor David Prowse, better known for a role he played in some obscure sci-fi series. The last film in the Hammer Frankenstein cycle was released in 1974. The film begins with Dr. Simon Helder, played by Shane Bryant, attempting to replicate the work of the Baron Frankenstein. He is caught and sentenced to 1 year in an insane asylum. We come to find that the asylum is being run by a Dr. Carl Victor, an alias for the Baron Frankenstein, once again played by Peter Cushing, returning to the role he created 17 years prior, although wearing a blonde wig. Cushing's character seems at home in the asylum, providing medical care for the patients and treating them with a surprising amount of kindness. However, he keeps a wing of special patients that we later discover he is cultivating for parts. Helder joins him in his work, which is based on Herr Schneider, a brute of an inmate that fell to his death and was resurrected by Frankenstein. The Baron is replacing parts one at a time to apparently rebuild and rehabilitate the patient. The creature, once again played by David Prowse, is a disturbing sort of hunchback Neanderthal. But once the brain of an inmate who is a mathematical genius is transplanted into the brute's body, he speaks. He asks why, and we feel compassion for him, just as we felt for Karloff's original creation.
You committed suicide, Professor Durandale. But I saved your brain, and I've given you a new body.
You've done it. You've made it work. You've done it. We did it. The three of us.
No, you did. Baron Frankenstein. No one else. No one has ever done this before. No one in this world. Now perhaps they'll accept and understand what I'm trying to achieve.
Of course they will. Let's drink to that.
Cushing is at his best in this film, and it ends with a tease that there is more to come. Sadly, this was the last of the Hammer Frankenstein films, and the last time Peter Cushing played the Baron. We are fortunate that they saved the best for last.
Go back to your rooms. There's nothing more for you to see. It's all over now.